Between the Acts is the final novel by Virginia Woolf. It was published shortly after her death in 1941. Although the manuscript had been completed, Woolf had yet to make final revisions. The book describes the mounting, performance, and audience of a play at a festival in a small English village, just before the outbreak of the Second World War. Since the play is inside the story, much of the novel is written in verse, and it is thus one of Woolf's most lyrical works. The story takes place in a country house somewhere in England, just before the Second World War, over the course of a single day. It is the day when the annual pageant is to be performed on the grounds of the house. The pageant is traditionally a celebration of English history, and it is attended by the entire local community. The owner of the house is Bartholomew Oliver, a widower and retired Indian Army officer. His sister Lucy Swithin, who is also living in the house, is slightly eccentric but kind. Bartholomew has a son, Giles, who has a job in London and is restless and frustrated. Giles has 2 children with his wife Isa, who has lost interest in him. Isa is attracted to a local gentleman farmer, Rupert Haynes, although the relationship goes no further than eye contact. Mrs. Manresa and her friend William Dodge arrive and stay for the pageant. The pageant has been written by Miss Latrobe, a strange and domineering spinster. The day is interspersed with events leading up to the pageant. Lucy fusses around making preparations for the decorations and the food. Bartholomew frightens his grandson by jumping out at him from behind a newspaper and then calls him a coward when he cries. Mrs. Manresa flirts provocatively with Bartholomew and Giles. William Dodge, assumed by the others to be homosexual, is the subject of homophobic thoughts by many of the others but is friendly with Lucy. The pageant occurs in the evening, and it has 3 main parts which are broken up by intermissions, during which the audience members interact with one another. Following a prologue by a child who represents England, the first scene is a Shakespearean scene with romantic dialogue. The second scene is a parody of a Restoration comedy, and the third scene is a panorama of Victorian triumph based on a policeman directing the traffic in Hyde Park. The final scene is entitled, Ourselves, at which point Miss Latrobe shocks the audience by having the cast turn mirrors on them. When the pageant ends and the audience disperses, Miss Latrobe retreats to the village pub and, brooding over what she perceives to be the pageant's failure, begins to plan her next drama. As darkness descends, cloaking the country house, Giles and Isa are left alone, presumably resulting in conflict and reconciliation. Between the acts summary. These notes were contributed by members of the Gradesaver community. We are thankful for their contributions and encourage you to make your own. Just before the hostilities that would come to be known as World War II kick into inexorably high gear, the annual tradition of a pageant intending to observe and celebrate British history is the high point of June at Points Hall. The ancestral manor of the Oliver family becomes the focus of the entire village most years, and 1939 is no different. The Oliver family is composed of Bartholomew, the patriarchal widower and veteran of the English wars to contain various attempted uprisings by the colonial Indians. Bartholomew's sister Lucy, also widowed after the death of her husband Mr. Swithin, brings a certain insipid eccentricity to the Points Hall. Giles, scion of the patriarch, is dealing with the effects of having lost a job in the city, and this year's celebration only adds to his sense of frustration. Another source of his irritation is the fact that his wife Ilsa is another occupant along with their 2 children. This is irritating because she has pretty much cut herself loose emotionally from her husband and is not exactly discreet about her attraction to a farmer named Haynes. Other key characters introduced are the mannish and domineering author of the pageant, Miss Latrobe, the bohemian Mrs. Manresa, her Jewish husband and her suspiciously foppish friend William Dodge, Albert the requisite village idiot and Eliza Clark, shopkeeper in her normal life, and Queen Elizabeth during the pageant. The event leading to the actual performances are marked by Lucy's obsessive devotion to making sure the decorations and food are just right. At one point, the old man nearly scares his grandson into a state of apoplexy merely with the unexpected revelation of his face from behind his newspaper. Mr. Oliver's reaction to this reaction is to ensure the child devolves into a flood tears by insulting him with accusations of cowardice. Both Bartholomew and Giles are the target aggressively flirtatious behavior by the free-thinking Mrs. Manresa. And finally, it is time to settle in and enjoy the show. Miss Latrobe's portrayal of crucial events in British history take the form of a montage of tableaus that requires form-match content as a means of connect modern-day England back through time to the Middle Ages. For instance, the Restoration become a satire of Restoration stage comedy, and navigation through the complexities of Victorian era are personified in the form of a police officer directing traffic. Bookending these various tableaux are a prologue recitation by a young child and a finale that literally forces the audience to examine their place in the timeline by having the mirrors turned toward them. As the production ends, Miss La Trobe's idiosyncratic interpretation of history is met with all the confusion and bewilderment of those picking up a modernist novel and wondering just what all this experimental stream of consciousness stuff was supposed to mean, exactly. Convinced that she has failed to open minds to the possibilities of creative expression, Miss La Trobe heads to the local pub to drown her sorrows, only to realize in a moment of epiphany what form her next creative endeavor will take. As for the residents of Points Hall, the ending of the play mean nothing more than life can go back to normal until next year. Between the Acts is the final novel written by English author Virginia Woolf. It was first published in 1941, shortly after her death. Set on a June afternoon in 1939, as the Second World War ramps up on the European mainland, it takes place at a country estate called Points Hall and focuses on the production of an annual pageant and play that local villagers hold at the estate. Exploring themes of fantasy, distraction, and triviality amid crisis, Between the Acts is not one of Woolf's better-known works but is praised for her trademark strength with dialogue and characters, as well as for its examination of the tropes and styles of British theatre. Between the Acts begins just before the outbreak of World War II, against the backdrop of an annual pageant celebrating British. The central point of the festival is the ancestral Points Hall manor belonging to the Oliver family, and in 1939 the festival is as important to the village as ever. The Oliver family is led by widower Bartholomew, a veteran of the English wars that attempted to put down revolts in colonial India. His sister Lucy, the widow of Mr. Swithin, is an eccentric whose odd manner brings some levity to the proceedings. Bartholomew's son Giles is still recovering from losing his job in the city, and is tense and frustrated as the festival ramps up. He has a difficult relationship with his wife Isa, who is sharing the house with him and their 2 children, but has made clear she's not in love with Giles anymore and is openly flirting with a local farmer named Haynes. As preparations for the pageant continue, other villagers file into the Oliver mansion to take part. They include the overbearing author of the pageant, Miss La Trobe, who insists on supervising. Each year, the eccentric bohemian Mrs. Manresa, her Jewish husband, and her dandy-like friend William Dodge. Shopkeeper Eliza Clark, normally a humble woman, is very much looking forward to her annual turn as Queen Elizabeth. Lucy, meanwhile, is obsessively checking that the decorations and food are to her specifications. At one point, Bartholomew startles his grandson by suddenly revealing his face from behind a newspaper, and when the boy unexpectedly begins crying, Bartholomew insults him by calling him a coward. Mrs. Manresa flirts relentlessly with almost every man at the village, but especially father and son Bartholomew and Giles. Finally, all the preparations are finished, and it is time for the crowds to settle in and enjoy the show. Miss La Trobe's recounting of British history takes the form of a series of short scenes that feature of a lot of artistic interpretation, and connect modern-day England back to the Elizabethan era. For instance, the opening scene pays tribute to Shakespeare by reenacting a scene with romantic dialogue. The Restoration era becomes a satire of Restoration stage comedy, while the Victorian era's complex series of social mores are depicted as a police officer directing traffic. The story is bookended by a prologue read by a young village child, and a finale that turns mirrors on the audience and demands that they examine themselves and their place in the timeline. As the odd and idiosyncratic play comes to a close, the village greets it with confusion and wonders exactly what they just saw. The stream of consciousness design is met with disinterest by more viewers. Convinced that she's failed to open the villagers' minds with to her artistic vision, Miss La Trobe abandons the festival to drown her sorrows in a local pub. While there, she realizes that she has the idea for her next creative endeavor, one that she'll present to the village at the next festival. As for the residents of Points Hall, the play ends and life gradually returns to normal, although the specter of war and their personal issues remain. Giles and Isa are left alone, and they begin to sort out their relationship, as the narrator mentions that they'll have more fights but eventually reconcile. Virginia Woolf was an English author. She is considered one of the foremost modernists of the 20th century and one of the pioneers of the stream of consciousness style of writing. A prolific author, she wrote 9 novels during her lifetime, as well as 6 collections of short stories, 4 published after her death, 3 biographies, a comedy for the stage, and a large collection of nonfiction, essays, translations, and biographies. She is regarded as one of the most influential writers in the early feminist tradition, and has influenced many future works, most famously the 1998 novel and 2002 Oscar-winning film adaptation The Hours, focusing on 3 generations of women influenced by Mrs. Dalloway, and the acclaimed 1962 play Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. The night before. Between the acts begins as the Olivers gather together at their home Points Hall on the evening before an annual pageant. One of the neighbors is visiting with Mr. Bart Oliver. They sit chatting about the problem the village faces in accessing clean water. Mention of a cesspool echoes throughout their discussion, indicating the stagnant aspects of their remote village lives. Mr. Oliver's daughter-in-law Isa Oliver interrupts their conversation to begin making plans for the following day. She has a crush on the visiting neighbor's husband. She is carried away by a memory of a tennis party where Rupert Haynes handed her a racket and caused her heart to leap. It isn't long before her hatred for her husband Giles Oliver is made obvious upon his return home the next day. The day begins. The day of the pageant begins with pleasant weather. The director of the play that will be held decides to have the stage and seats set up outside. The villagers have worried about the possibility of rain each year for the past 7 years that they have held the annual pageant. The barn is decorated just in case it does rain and the audience has to move indoors. The barn is a noble structure that has stood on the grounds of Points Hall for 7 centuries. It is as old as the church, and it seems to hold the history of the little village within its sturdy architecture. Preparations are underway when the Oliver family is surprised by a couple of visitors who happened upon Points Hall as they were looking for a spot to picnic. They introduce themselves as Mrs. Manresa and her friend William Dodge. Mr. Bart Oliver feels obliged to offer them a spot on the lawn to enjoy their lunch. Mrs. Manresa is a gregarious woman who chats with the Olivers and makes them feel like they have known her for years. They invite her to stay for the pageant. She is delighted and agrees. William Dodge remains quiet. Mrs. Manresa is in charge of making their plans for the day. The audience arrives. The villagers arrive in the afternoon as the director of the play Miss Latrobe makes the final arrangements for the performance. Giles Oliver returns from London where he works as a stockbroker. He is aggravated by news of violence in England and the threat of war. He politely gets dressed for the pageant even though he feels frustrated by the mundane affairs of village life. The gramophone sounds and indicates that the play has begun. It will tell the story of England. The villagers take their seats to watch. A few latecomers amble in and this makes Miss Latrobe upset. It isn't long before her frustration with the audience becomes increasingly apparent. She hides behind the bushes and shouts cues as one of the actresses forgets her lines. Miss Latrobe's script seems ambitious for a village performance, but she wants to communicate her vision. The audience attempts to make sense of the play, but they can't seem to find meaning in it. They feel frustrated by the long periods of silence and the final section that presents ourselves with distorted mirrors on stage. The village's religious leader Reverend Streatfield delivers a speech suggesting the play's theme is that we act different parts but are the same. The director Miss Latrobe decides that the audience is a devil, and that she has miscalculated their ability to confront reality. She ends the night feeling like a failure and refuses to answer anyone's questions about the play. The villagers leave in a state of confusion, wondering how to make sense of the day's events. Night descends. The final scenes of the novel take place back at Points Hall just before the Olivers retire for the night. The Olivers don't agree as to whether the play was a success or a failure. Each has a different view of what it might have signified. Mr. Bart Oliver reads the paper and falls asleep in his chair with his dog at his feet. Mrs. Lucy Swithin gets back to reading her book outlining history. Isa and Giles argue and then embrace. An unsettled feeling pervades the hall as if it is drained of its capacity to offer the comforts associated with a home. The novel sums up and magnifies Woolf's chief preoccupations: the transformation of life through art, sexual ambivalence, and meditation on the themes of flux of time and life, presented simultaneously as corrosion and rejuvenation, all set in a highly imaginative and symbolic narrative encompassing almost all of English history. 1. It is the most lyrical of all her works, not only in feeling but in style, being chiefly written in verse. 2. While Woolf's work can be understood as consistently in dialogue with the Bloomsbury Group, particularly due to its tendency, informed by G.E. More, among others towards doctrinaire rationalism, it is not a simple recapitulation of the coteries' ideals.